Jared Isaacman is out as the next NASA administrator, cut by the very administration that had nominated him. And the new administration's budget proposal for FY 2016 for NASA is devastating. And I'm going to tell you why and what you can do about it. First news coming out today that was a shock to all of us in the space community. It was a shock that Jared Isaacman was nominated in the first place, but he was a rather inspired choice, in my opinion. I thought he was a really interesting pick for the next NASA administrator. He had gone through the process of the Senate hearing, because it's the Senate that needed to confirm him. He went through that process of submitting testimony afterwards, and he got a date finally. It was Senator Ted Cruz who needed to be convinced that this was the right choice to lead NASA after the Trump administration had proposed his name. And finally on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, was his date to be voted on, and suddenly the White House is saying that he is out, that they no longer considering him as NASA administrator, and that they will choose someone else. The quote from the White House is, "It is essential that the next leader of NASA is in complete alignment with President Trump's America First agenda, and a replacement will be announced directly by President Trump soon." Now, we don't know what happened in the background. Sources say that this was a decision made by the administration. I'm wondering if it had to do with this budget cut, this massive budget cut, because NASA is being destroyed. The institution of NASA is being destroyed if this budget goes forward. And who would be the person who volunteers to be the leader to support such massive cuts that would literally end quite a number of the things that NASA is known to lead the world in? I thought this is a terrible choice, a surprisingly awful choice, a really embarrassing situation for the administration to suddenly back out of what was, we thought, going to be a sure thing. We thought NASA would have a leader. And since the Trump administration, the second Trump administration started in January, NASA's been without a leader. They've had an interim NASA administrator who does not necessarily have the authority to lead NASA the way a full NASA administrator would. A NASA administrator was about to be confirmed this coming Tuesday and now suddenly isn't. They have to start all over with the whole process. So they have to nominate someone, they have to have another Senate confirmation hearing, and they have to have a vote, assuming that the Senate actually approves of whoever the replacement is. I am so sorry, Jared. You deserved better than this. Moving on to the budget that came out late yesterday afternoon, when you know it's a bad sign when it comes out like Friday, 5 o'clock or whatever it was, because it means they want to bury it. And there's no way this is going to be buried. It is a torpedo at NASA. First off, it's a massive budget cut, which we expect because one of the things that this administration is trying to do is cut the federal spending. And I can't blame them for wanting to cut waste and inefficiencies out of the federal spending, but that's not what this budget is, not even close. This budget is pretty much the opposite of that, in that it is making things that are already productive ineffective or canceling them altogether to eliminate the productivity of NASA. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The numbers are NASA's actual budget for FY 2025 is $24.9 billion. And this budget proposal would cut that to $18.8 billion. That's a massive cut. That's almost like a quarter of NASA just being lopped off like immediately, not a ramp down, a cut over time, just simply chop. For comparison, the Space Force proposed budget for FY 2026 is $28.7 billion. And I remember it was just a few years ago that the Space Force budget surpassed NASA's budget. And we saw that as a bit of a milestone, like, oh, hey, they're funded about the same. And actually, Space Force now gets a little more. Compare now to FY 2026 budget requests of $28 billion versus $18 billion. It's a difference of a third. I'm like, that is huge. And so it's not a surprise. What you're already seeing is that a lot of the space industry that has worked on civil and commercial space is now moving towards national defense military space. And so we are already seeing the effects of this budget cut on the civil side and budget enhancement, especially when it comes to the Golden Dome on the national defense side. The Planetary Society says that this is the lowest budget, the smallest budget for NASA since 1961. Now, NASA was formed in 1958, and it was just, kind of restructuring the NACA in a sense to form NASA. That was the very beginning of NASA before it had all the other things that it took on after the NACA, before Apollo. Apollo really ramped up NASA's budget because human exploration and ambitious goals and huge visions require money. So this is a gigantic cut But NASA's already doing these ambitious goals. That means all the other things need to be cut, aside from like a really narrow sliver of ambitious goals, which we're going to talk about because it's a really narrow sliver here. The NASA direct funded civil service force would be cut by about a third. I don't know where these numbers come from, but they report that it would go from 17,391 personnel to 11,853 personnel. For some reason, there's a lot of backlash right now against the civil service, even though they get paid a lot less. They actually take pay cuts to work in the jobs that they do. If they worked in industry, they'd be paid more. They actually are doing their jobs at a discount for the benefit of our nation. What's devastating are the programs. And we already knew that Mars sample return was going to be cut. We already knew it was probably on the chopping board based on the fact that under the Biden administration, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson was saying that it was over budget and too expensive and it needed to be reworked. So even though there are literal tubes, little canisters all over the Martian surface waiting to be picked up and brought back to Earth, they're just gonna have to stay there at least for a while longer because Mars sample return is cut under this budget. Also canceled are a number of programs in the works. I'm not gonna go over all of them. I'm gonna have the budget and a number of relevant documents in the comments section. It's better to read these things than it is for me to spout numbers. Being cut are 2 Venus missions, some smaller missions that I was really excited about because first off, we tend to ignore Venus, and second off, I was actually involved in the selection process for these 2 missions. That was Veritas and Da Vinci. When we're talking about exploring the solar system, we actually need to go put money towards some of these smaller probes to go explore it. And what's really mind-boggling to me is the cancellation of programs and missions that are already happening. You spend all this money, you spend all this time to put things in space, and then suddenly you're just going to cancel them even though they're doing productive work. So there's a lot of that in this budget, and it's just, this is what I mean by this budget does not get rid of inefficiencies. It cuts NASA's legs off. It makes NASA produce less for the money spent. One in particular, I know that, atmospheric science, earth science, climate science is going to be cut under a Republican administration, like that's understood. But one in particular, Cyclone Global Navigation Satellite System, or CYGNSS. Cyclone is another word for hurricane. I live in Florida. The hurricane season starts tomorrow. I want to have those satellites in space to give us those pictures. When I go to NOAA's website and I look at the tracking, the predicted track of a hurricane, I want those satellites to give us the most accurate data. Other missions that are already doing productive science, productive work that are proposed to be cut under this budget. Juno. That's a mission to Jupiter. New Horizons, you remember New Horizons to Pluto? Well, after it went to Pluto, it kept on going. It's kind of like the Voyager missions, which are going for decades. They just keep going with minimal involvement of everybody. Just a couple of years ago, wasn't even last year, New Horizons got new life. And they fought for their budget and they won because it's so little money. And now it's proposed to be cut. Osiris Apex, that's a continuation of the OSIRIS-REx mission because again, it's already out there. It's already going to places. Chandra X-ray Observatory and Fermi. These are near and dear to my heart. I never directly worked on either of these programs, but I worked with the people. I was working on a smaller gamma ray observatory, and I remember when Fermi was launched, we were just so excited to have this observatory in space. I mean, these are things that help us understand our universe. It's, in my opinion, crucial for NASA to understand the universe, for us as humanity to understand our universe. I understand that that's not going to make anybody a profit. And that is something I want to address right here, right now, before any of you put something in the comments about how SpaceX can do it better. No, my goodness, no. I don't understand the mindset of a private company is going to take on a huge amount of science work that does not have a return on investment. No company is going to do that. Even a company like Rocket Lab that is working on their own Venus mission because Peter Beck likes Venus, they're doing it on the weekend. It's really slow work. It's a really teeny tiny probe of a mission. It's like nothing compared to what NASA can do because US taxpayers decided that it's important to put a minuscule amount of their tax dollars. We're talking a tiny, tiny amount of what we spend in terms of our overall budget towards understanding our universe. And so apparently the Trump administration doesn't think that's important. And there's no private company that's going to take that on. And private companies are going to be hurt by this budget, because who builds these observatories? It's private companies. It's contractor and subcontractors and suppliers and component makers. There's a reason why NASA is so spread out across the country, not because they need to be, but because they want that supply chain to be nationwide to benefit all the taxpayers. It's both a blessing and a curse that NASA does this. It's inefficient in that sense, but also it does provide an economic benefit for people who are supplying sensors and electronics and everything else that goes into these missions that now apparently just don't matter to the Trump administration. And also, as much as I am a fan of SpaceX, their mission is tiny. It is tiny. It is to launch, it is to do Starlink, and it is to go to Mars. NASA does so much more, so much more. So we're talking about destroying NASA's broad portfolio of all the science and engineering that it does to shrink down to one thing. And that's not what NASA's here for, in my opinion. It's not what NASA was created for. Plutonium-238 cancellation. This one is also personal to me because the very first time I ever went to Congress, the first time I ever went to Washington, D.C. to advocate for space, I was a graduate student, and it was to restart Plutonium-238 so that we could have deep space missions, Mars missions, and then beyond that use Plutonium-238. It is not weapons grade. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these kinds of energy sources to power the electronics in the vehicles and warm them when we go out beyond where the sun is efficiently able to warm up our solar panels. And the reason why, as a young grad student, I had to go out to advocate for this is because we in the United States had cut our production of Plutonium-238 and were relying on the Russians. The Russians were producing it. They were producing very, very little, and we didn't know how much more they had. We didn't know how much more they were going to give us. It would literally end like our Mars missions, that the Mars rovers that rely on this kind of thing, as well as some others. And so I went as a graduate student and was so excited that just a couple of years later, we did restart Plutonium-238 production in the United States. And do we want to go backwards? Do we want to end it now and rely again on the Russians to produce Plutonium-238 for us? It wants to absolutely destroy the International Space Station for some reason. Minimum safe operations and very limited research essential to support Moon and Mars exploration until 2030, which is when it's planned to be deorbited, when it will be replaced by commercial systems. So I have a whole video on why it's a terrible idea that we've spent 20 years and who knows how many billions of dollars to get the International Space Station to be the most impressive space laboratory that has ever existed, that will benefit both the transportation aspect of getting humans to Mars and also benefit how do we live and work off Earth and on Mars, and also just doing the fantastic science that can only be done in microgravity conditions. And so we spent all this time and all this money, and now that ISS is in its prime, we're just gonna cut it. We're gonna go minimal here. Why? What? If you spend all your time and money going halfway around the world on vacation, and then you decide you're just going to stay in your hotel room for your entire vacation, like what was the point? So if you want to watch that video, I ranted a good bit on that video as well about why that's a terrible idea. I understand, and I think it's a good idea actually, to extend the expeditions to go beyond 6 months. But cutting personnel, cutting science, why? They would cut all NASA public affairs except at NASA headquarters. They would cut some of the budget at NASA headquarters, and all of the NASA centers, it would cut their public affairs offices. Not such a great idea when you want to decentralize communication so that you can have like actual people at the actual centers reporting on what these centers are doing. I'm here in Florida. Do you want somebody at headquarters to be the one to tell you what's happening with the rocket launch that's about to happen in Florida? Like, is that what you want? Like, that does not seem efficient to me. Cut STEM engagement, previously known as STEM education. So this was something that popped up during the first Trump administration. All 4 years of the first Trump administration, they zeroed out the NASA education or NASA engagement budget. And all 4 years, the Congress funded it to its full amount, which is very, very, very tiny amount, like we're nothing money. And this one pisses me off so much because so many people I know had NASA internships because of that budget. I was funded through the NASA Space Grant Consortium. Every state in the United States has a NASA Space Grant office, and they fund students. And one of my NASA internships was funded through that program. It's not a waste of money to train the students who will be taking over the jobs in 10 years or so. Now, it's not all cutting. they've added quite a bit, like something like $1 billion to this new initiative to do Mars. We already knew that we're canceling SLS and Orion after Artemis 3 and canceling the Lunar Gateway. And they're creating something called the Moon to Mars Infrastructure and Transportation Program that relies on commercial vehicles. I think that's a good idea. I don't know what this breakdown is going to be. One interesting thing I found in there, you know how there's commercial lunar payload services, CLIPS? Well, now there's going to be a commercial Mars payload services. Doesn't flow off the tongue, but I actually think that's a great idea. So I applaud them for thinking about that, why you have to cut every other thing, astrophysics, heliophysics. By the way, studying the sun directly impacts life on Earth because the sun emits energy and particles which disrupt our energy grid and disrupt our satellites and disrupt a whole bunch of stuff that modern technology uses. So like these things over here that they're cutting are important, but they don't give a shit so that they can fund Mars. At least that's the current plan under this budget proposal. Congress is in no way going to agree to this stuff. Oh my gosh. There is no way Congress is going to agree to this budget, but we can't take that for granted. What I think this is just like slashing NASA to see what Congress fights for. And so we, as Americans, sorry if you're watching this from another country, there's not much you can do. But if you are here in the United States, you can contact your elected representatives, your federal elected representatives. You contact them and you tell them that NASA is important and why, and what specific things about NASA is important and what they should do with the budget proposal that the Trump administration has proposed. We already got some indications in Jared Isaacman's confirmation hearing. Sorry, Jared. But we did get some indications that Congress, or at least the Senate, is fighting back against the skitty budget proposals that they knew about at the time. So I did a video on that. If you want to watch that, Congress is pretty set, or at least I should say Ted Cruz is pretty set on protecting what's already in the law, some of the laws that he helped to make, which is lunar, cislunar. There's definitely going to be people at certain congressional districts and states that are going to be protecting, let's say, Goddard Space Center and JPL, some of these ones that are going to really suffer from these budget cuts. If you've been following me for a while, you know I'm not prone to hype or hyperbole or doomerism. Like, that's just not my style. So for me to be using strong language like this, it's intentional because this is disastrous. This will destroy the US leadership in space. This will make it so that the institution of NASA will be changed for decades, because once you let a bunch of people go and end a bunch of missions, it is not easy to restart that. People get new jobs. People leave the industry. And we're talking about these highly educated, highly skilled people who are here to work in the space industry would leave. There are small businesses and perhaps medium-sized businesses that are going to go out of business because they were relying on the supply chain of providing the technology and the hardware and the manufacturing for the missions that NASA puts in space. The large prime contractors will pivot to the defense sector. Is that what we want as a nation? Like, yes, we need to have a strong defense sector, but do we want all of our space efforts to be focused on looking down at Earth? Or do we want to also look at the stars? And it's up to you, as someone who's watching this and has the power to take action, use your voice, write letters, write an email, whatever you need to do to make sure that this budget is not enacted.